Greetings! I am going to dedicate this video to examining the major themes, categories that happened in the World Information Architecture Day a few weeks back, according to my point of view, which was basically a totally random online remote experience. I was not at any of the 52 locations. I was not physically present, but I was present online. Initially, I went to the website and took a look at who was streaming live and, made a notation that those were the events that I wanted to check out. Then the night before, I checked in on and then on Twitter, through Twitter, which is my major platform that I've been on for a while, I decided that I would start, to see what's on the hashtags for the World Information Architecture Day 18 hashtag, and found out that the Japanese World Information Architecture event that was streaming live from Tokyo was in full effect. I actually missed the first talk. And so then I kind of spent the night watching that and tweeting and interacting that way. And then Europe came online sometime in the morning. And then somehow I shifted into North America and down into South America. Yes, this is the review of World Information Architecture Day 2018, in which I participated entirely remotely and online. And my experience was a 24 hours experience. And I was on Twitter and I took a lot of screenshots, which I wanted to organize, and which I did. But before I show you what I organized and how I organized that information, I want to take a step back to the Information Architects Summit that happened last Vancouver. Around this time, I was preparing last year to go to it. And it was the first one that I attended. I was a newbie, newcomer. And my biggest takeaway that I came back with, and I'm still inspired by, a year later, was around ethics. In fact, this topic of ethics came up through a discussion at the Emily Carr College. Well, actually, it's the university now, which was my college. And there was a panel discussion. And Kaleem Khan from Toronto was on that panel. And he spoke about ethics. And he quoted this particular author from The Craftsman, which says, "It is at the level of mastery that ethical problems of craft appear." That really, really intrigued me. As a matter of fact, I was so inspired, I came home and I created a website called 3 Times Ethical, which, basically talks about ethical research and information architecture and design. And that's kind of what I put out to the world. Of course, it was not well received. Nobody cares about ethics, really, unless you've mastered your craft. And, it's hard enough to talk about UX, user experience, or information architecture, never mind ethics. But nevertheless, this is my guiding light. So another thing that occurred, another model that I built, had to do with a workshop that I took with the information architect, Andreas Razimi. He wrote the book called Persuasive Information Architecture. The workshop was on cross-channel user experiences and how to design them. And he basically has a position where this is the information architecture of the post-web age, in which he argues that, the website is no longer the focus, that we have to take a look at the fundamentally multidisciplinary sense-making culture construct concerned with the structural integrity of meaning in complex information-based cross-channel ecosystems. So the challenge in his workshop was to showed the ecosystem that brought us into the actual event. So mine was reading the book by Peter Morville on information architecture. I had it for a long time, but for some reason I was reading a chapter of it, and then it referenced this event, and then I clicked on the link and got to the Information Architecture Institute, and then I found out they had this summit going on, and then I booked my flight, and then my Airbnb, and then I showed up. But when I was mapping out my ecosystem inputs, I took a bigger picture view. Art is my foundation. And with art, we have the question of ethics. So I was philosophy and ethics. I was familiar with that conversation. I worked as an agent of change in business, doing basically sales and marketing, mostly for technology. Businesses, hardware, software. So questions of ethics also arose there. And then, of course, I went into the exploration of UX, user experience, as the bigger umbrella under which, the business, marketing, branding, customer experience falls. And then the ethics of that are also there. And then, of course, information architecture, which is something I've been interested in since art school. But I had no idea. Richard Saul Wurman, I read his book, or saw his book in the library, and I was like, wow. Somebody proposed, actually, MIT magazine called Leonardo talked about that the fact that artists are more interested in managing information than they are in personal expression. That was definitely me, but I had no idea how to become an information architect. So this was my big picture model for how my inputs of my ecosystem. So yeah, I decided I was going to categorize these, sort of do a card sort. Initially, I tried to do it with Trello, and that wasn't too successful because the ability to move in and out, which is exactly what I'm trying to do here, the ability to move easily in and out of these So here I'm moving out. This is what I did. I had all of these tweets captured from Twitter, basically look like they're cards, so I try to organize them here. But, for me to actually, I love Zoom. I love to zoom in on things. It was hard because this is what you end up with. You end up with this image and a lot of other information, and it's kind of a lot of clicking around to get back. And so I decided to do the Prezi instead. So I organized it in a Prezi, and these are the major topics, categories, keywords. There we say taxonomy, the four that after over 24 hours that appeared for me. So this is how I organized sort of maybe ad hoc navigational system of my experience. Art was the number one. Visualization systems, data, and media. Those were the major categories from my point of view. So we started in Japan from Tokyo. It was a live stream. I missed the first speaker, as I mentioned, but I sort of arrived right here with the speaker looking up at this Western European Renaissance art, including Christ, which I studied a lot, looking at that, and then, of course, all the architectural influences. So I was quite surprised that she was referencing art, because you rarely get references to art. In fact, when I mentioned that I come from an art background, sort of dismissed as being not very relevant. But according to the Japanese, very relevant with respect to information architecture. This is another speaker talking about a model of design, which he sees as a folding fan, which has a very Japanese influence. Although this shape is basically a triangular shape with a central point, so it could actually represent like a tree. But nevertheless, very interesting visual model. The same speaker talked about life and nature, which is key also to art when I studied art. we would go out and draw trees. In fact, one of my favorite things was to draw trees, and then plants, flowers, and so on. Studied from nature, studied human anatomy, and then he spoke about regeneration and degeneration, and this concept fundamental to the Eastern way of looking at life. One of the speakers cautioned or warned us to beware of hardness, which is basically a condition which can kill life, and that often good technology suffocates the aspiration of life. And nevertheless, it still continues to be approved as good, appropriate, or right. So it's a key philosophical thing about, the ethics here, and also art. Art imitates life. There's I've forgotten a lot about the philosophies of different artists, but this art spirit. Anyhow, he cautions because this technology can be a lonesome technology, make us very alone. So that query was also made as to what is architecture, reference to Ruskin, architecture being the first art. It's not just a building, it's art, a medium between humans and God, which is, of course, the spiritual aspect of architecture. We see that in the Egyptian pyramids. Ruskin referencing, the European architecture, and the medium of God was established. Again, we see the reference to the Bible, the Old Testament, and finally, architecture of information as the first art, as a first art follows the tradition, which, I had to question what tradition, because the Japanese tradition of art is very unique. It has a sort of two-dimensional quality. Everything is flattened in space, a totally different representation of space as opposed to three-dimensional Renaissance, perspective where everything is drawn out on this grid. Basically, the vanishing point, the horizon, totally different worldview in the two dimensions. And now we also have this ongoing discourse between 2D and 3D. I first experienced that, of course, in art. Then my next experience had to do with animation, 2D versus 3D. And then, of course, we look at websites. There was a time where all logos were 3D, extruded 3D. Now we see the flat 2D websites as being, the band. Now we're moving into VR again. So we're going back into this virtual reality. The truth is that humans actually don't think in 3 dimensions. We think in 2. So this is an ongoing discourse as to what tradition we're going to follow. This was the agenda for the day. These were the speakers. As I mentioned, I missed the first one. Chelsea Holtzetter, she did a talk on LGBTQ, so talking about culture, community. And then there was a panel discussion between the speakers, streamed as well. And then after lunch, there was another streaming speaker who came in from Oxford, Luciano Floridi, who spoke about the age of good design. He's a philosopher, professor of philosophy and ethics. So there's your ethics again, and there's the philosophy, and there's a connection again back to the Western view. Nevertheless, he was beamed in and presented his theory on digital design. Here's his model for that process, the cleaving, the innovation, the design, and the logic. Digital design basically having what he says an enormous cleaving power, offering more affordances and fewer constraints, breaking the relationships between presence and location, law and territorial, for instance, and cleaving concepts like production and consumption, authenticity and memory, information, identity, analog and digital, online, offline. Because, and the reason that he's examining this is because we need design to give us new answers to the open questions that have been posed by the information revolution, particularly what he calls the human project, with capitalism now no longer aligned with consumerism, but rather it could be cleaved to fostering, and therefore design would be a force of good. So yeah, the next talk came out of Kent State on visual representation of knowledge structures by Marcia L. Zhang, who wrote a book called Metadata, and she took a romp through the visual representation of knowledge, qualitative and quantitative, and interestingly enough, started with the sensible design of the Egyptians, which I always reference back to Egypt. I mean, I always look for source, and I always end up in Egyptian design, philosophy, culture. Basically, there's nothing I've looked at so far that doesn't go back, originate in Egypt. So that she flushes it out with other visual representations, and then focuses on the tree of life, where she says it appeared first in Chinese documents, was introduced by a Jesuit priest who came to China, and so that. But interestingly enough, again, here we have the European introducing it into Chinese culture with no reference to the African Egyptian culture from which it came, because my studies of art show quite clearly the tree of life appears behind, the gods and goddesses of it in Egypt. This is the god probably Atem, and the tree of life is seen in behind him. In fact, there are some spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, which references, actually, if you trace it back to India, the tree of life was central iconography. And then the Buddhists put the man under the tree, Buddha meditating under the tree. And then the Christians took the tree and cut it down and planed it into two planks and then hung up this Christ. So there's an interesting relationship with the tree in iconography, spiritual, and otherwise in information architecture. We see it becoming a circle, radial trees, and the pros and cons of particular structures of information. Here's the sunburst layout. And again, during the talk, Marcia said, she didn't quite know where the circular icon came from, but in my opinion, again, in my mind, I saw the Eye of Horus, which is a central iconography. I think on the capstone of the pyramids, you have a bee, and then you have the eye being the highest forms of information, symbols representing. Then we look at the moving rapidly forward in time, the structure of nodes with the Internet of Things and the intertwingledness, the connections between all of these things that we are experiencing and will be. Then she goes back to the tree map. This is the mosaic graph. This is a flattened out representation used, I guess, very effectively in the in the markets, representing markets here. Stock market exchange. Again, she goes back to the circle packing layouts, which have a lot of pros, but I guess one of the cons is that people get lost in that structure. The Chinese representation here, a model of information based on, again, the tree of life, and then a European interpretation or representation of information from the 18th century, and summarizes with the most popular visual models, which basically, from my understanding of art, there's three forms. There's the triangle, the circle, and the square. So, whereas Kandinsky wrote, line, point to plane. So you have point, line to plane. Excuse me. So you have a point, which could be a circle or a little dot. You join the dots, you get a line. You join the lines, you get a plane. A square or a triangle. It's basically all of shapes and forms come out of that. So that's the summary of that. I just quickly threw together this collage afterwards, as in the roots of the tree of life. Visualization systems, again, go harken back to Egypt, in my opinion, from my point of view. Which brings us to the whole weird UX theory, which basically I'm reading right now, or listening to Peter Morville's book called Intertwingled in Information Architecture, where some researchers in UBC came up with this theory of WIAD being the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. So this perspective or point of view, call it weird UX, surely showed itself in this first two talks. Japanese were referencing, the Renaissance art. The Chinese scholar was referencing the Jesuit priest. But both of them should be referencing, I think they should be stepping further back, looking at their own ancient cultures, or the most ancient that we have historically a lot of knowledge of is the African culture of the ancient Egyptians. Its pyramid, its architecture seems to be lacking in a lot of discussions. But so then we come to the weird, the data thing, the obsession with the data, the raw data, and the ethics of that. A presentation called Data Fracking, an ethical approach to big data, presented by this interesting pairing. We have Ren, the information architect, African American, and the woman here who, Laura, I believe, who works for information technology systems in America. So the two of them presented this idea of how traditionally information architects interact with data, sort of, using that information to create personas, doing competitive analysis, creating the copy, the literature review, the content strategy. But also, if you have a product like a taxi app, you have other sources of data coming in, GPS, phone directories, traffic density, and then of course social media, social UX as valid information. But they sort of map out this model, which shows that there's a lot of levels to this big data. And the deepest level is the customer data, which brings up questions of privacy. Their private data, and then the geolocation services, where they are in time and space, and then the social media data, the sharing of information by individuals in this space of their own information or others. Then the next layer, you have news feeds, data services, public data, metadata. And above that, you have corporate data and marketing data. So they were warning again that we have to be very careful, because what can be taken out of these data models, we have SEO in the corporate side, but we also have these issues we have to deal with. Privacy, sharing, acquisition, identity extraction, because this can be used for good or for evil. We look at, racial profiling is a huge issue, because data has no soul. And we know that these algorithms are created by a certain weird group themselves. So it can also be used to manipulate or to misrepresent information on environmental issues. There's a map of Fukushima radiation after the event on their website, which, basically they use the circular model here and then extruded into 3 dimensions and made it totally pop art, but not very informative. People couldn't understand what this meant. So a group you know, here we have the issues. They were trying to do, I guess, something like this, the circular radial tree structure, whatever. A group from Caltech decided to, you know, reorganize that information for radiation visualization, and they came up with this website, which gave people more information, better information they were looking for. So the last category was media, and this was from a talk given by Dan Klein in Florida, and starting from the conditions, information architecture, starting from conditions more or less utilitarian. You know, we've all established certain relationships from the beginning of time, gathering around the fire. But media itself has laws. So he's referencing McLuhan, and Marcia McLuhan, of course, has a laws of media, a book on it, and theory about how it enhances, reverses, retrieves, and obsolesces. It's called the tetrad. Every single thing that extends our human senses is a form of media. A chair I'm sitting on is, you know, every artifact, poem, song, gadget. So all of these can be seen under this, or in this tetrad, for their effects, the effects of media. Yeah, and this is a quote, which basically says it's like fun to try to figure out. You take a form of media and then you try to figure out the 4 aspects. So this is information architecture, according to Dan Klein. You know, it enhances the information carrying capacity. It reverses the neutral Cartesian grids, retrieves the choreographer and the protocol officer, and it obsolesces the problem statement. So this is a very interesting. Protocol officer, lots to think about there. Then he talks about architects as well, what they said about information or about architecture. You know, this is Le Corbusier basically saying that it is organization, and that you are an organizer, not a drawing board artist. Coming again from art, where I was intrigued by the idea of organizing information, managing it, as opposed to, you know, personal expression. And then another quote here, which if you read through it, and bottom line is, you know, that you have you establish relationships which arouse emotions. This is architecture. This is also a transformative type of architecture, as opposed to just a purely transactional one, which is, I think, where we're moving in the thought leadership for information architecture and UX, in looking how we need to reorganize or organize to be more inclusive and more diverse, and not just represent the weird UX perspective, referencing other cultures and other times, and creating, you know, transformative experiences. So again, information architecture enhances the information carrying capacity of the built environment. So this is where we exist now, the divergence or the convergence of online and offline and analog and digital, as referenced by the Oxford professor, the ability to have information flowing through our built environment. What information, though? So, you know, Dan warns that, you know, here we have the artist who's presenting their thing, but that thing has little bits that don't fit into the existing weird framework that we've constructed. So they basically have to take off all the little unusual bits and then classify it with the rest of the thing. So this is my experience. Even trying to get into any kind of space, always got the little bits don't fit in. It's a classic. So yeah, that's it. Those were the major keywords that came up for me at the World Information Architecture Day a few weeks ago. Thank you for your time.